So welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to have our guest with us today, David Haigh. David Haigh is the CEO of Brand Finance, one of the premier companies that measures brand value and located in the UK, specifically in London. And he's joining a colleague of mine and a professor here at the Wharton School, esteemed professor, Raghu Iyengar, who is also the director of Wharton Customer Analytics. And we're delighted to have you with us here today, David.
Yep, I'm delighted to be here.
So we're going to start things off by you giving us a little bit of your background and how long you've been the CEO of Brand Finance.
Okay, well, my background is that I'm a chartered accountant originally. I trained with Pricewaterhouse, and following that, I worked for a couple of companies as a finance director, latterly advertising agencies, which made me realize I was actually interested in advertising and marketing and branding. I then set up my own PR and marketing firm, which I ran for a few years and sold it to Publicis, which is a big advertising agency group. I then ran the below the line division of Publicis in London for 5 years. And during that time, I wrote a book called Strategic Control of Marketing Finance. And this brought me to the attention of some of my old PwC colleagues who had set up Interbrand. And they said, well, why don't you come and join us and be a brand valuer? So in 1995, I joined Interbrand as the co-head of their brand valuation unit, which was a global unit. And I did that for about 18 months and then left and set up Brand Finance. So our foundation date is the 1st of April, 1996, which we often laugh about, because it's April Fool's Day. And our 25th anniversary is coming up in about 3 weeks on the 1st of April. So we've been going for 25 years and we're very specialized. We do brand valuation, brand evaluation, and related strategy and transaction work. We now have about 100 staff worldwide. We're in about 25 locations, but our biggest location is London, right in the heart of the city, in the oldest part of the city where the coffee houses came from. Lovely place to be. And from there, we work on global clients.
That's great. I've known you for a number of years and I never knew all of that background. And that's absolutely fascinating to hear. So let's take the big question that we would like to address, which is really trying to think about, could you briefly tell us how the pandemic has affected brand finance and your clients?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. I said that brand finance has been going for 25 years, and that's a very long time, and I'm now very old. So I remember several different crises. We had a crisis in 2001 when the dot-com bubble burst, another one in 2009 when the financial crisis hit. And there was actually a second one a couple of years after that in about 2011 when there was a financial crisis in Europe. And the interesting thing about those three crises were that they were very fundamental, massive economic problems that resulted in lots of businesses going bust and many people being put out of work and all sorts of dire consequences. And for each one of those three, brand finance was put on the back foot and we were forced to cut our costs radically. So we were not sacking staff. What we actually tended to do was give people notice and say, look, we can't see where the revenue is coming from. So we're going to have to give you precautionary notice. And 3 months from now, if nothing has improved, we may have to lay you off. And in all three of those cases, there tended to be a rebound, but some people were made redundant. The big difference with this crisis, the COVID crisis, is that at the beginning of last year, we were preparing ourselves for another, great financial crisis like 2009. And we assumed that demand would drop and everything would, be terrible. The end result has not been terrible. And one of the primary reasons is many governments have stepped in and pumped money into the economy like crazy and supported jobs like crazy. So really, there has not been the big economic crash that we were anticipating this time last year.
Well, David, that's an interesting point. And some of the interviews that Dave and I have done, obviously, it's been a year or so now, and things are starting to look more positive. Things are going up as well. I think, what you mentioned also is kind of interesting in the following sense. One of the big things that has come up consistently, some of these interviews, is how consumers, the end consumers, unlike perhaps other recessions, are really wanting brands that are trustworthy. They are looking towards brand as a source of comfort, so to speak. So gravitating towards brands that are indeed those. Do you see that as well from a valuation perspective in the last year or so? Like are brands perhaps that were trustworthy have gone up more so in value versus others?
Well, one of the things I didn't mention when I introduced brand finance is that our primary mechanic for attracting attention to ourselves is that we do speculative valuations of brands from all over the world.
Yes.
And for the last 10 years or so, we've been doing 5,000 corporate brand valuations every year. In fact, we actually do about 10,000, but then we home it in and it ends up with about 5,000. So we're publishing lists in 40 countries and 40 sectors.
Yeah.
And it normally comes out in January. So in January 2020, we published the results that had been worked out in the previous 3 months before the crisis.
Yep.
And we were suddenly faced with this crisis and we were going, right, well, some of these sectors are going to go up and some are going to go down. Let's predict who's going to be the winners and the losers. So we were actually showing that we thought some would go up and some would go down. And then at a later point in the year, we evaluated what had gone up and down. Now, it's fairly clear that the things that have gone down are things like hotels, air travel, certain types of booze. Weirdly, beer has gone right down because the majority of beer is drunk in social environments, in pubs and stuff and bars, whereas spirits and wine have gone up because people are drinking it at home to drown their sorrows. And so we went across all the sectors and we found some that were going right up and some that were going down. And I think what it really comes down to is that as a result of being forced to change habits, consumers have been forced to change the way they consume things. And some things, I read that in the cosmetics sector, skincare products are up because people want to moisturize and so on. But lipstick and eyeliner and so on are down. And I also read that in the, or we have seen actually, that in the footwear market, things like training shoes and soft low heel shoes are doing well, but high heels are doing terribly. And I think across sectors, it's almost predictable which are the ones that are suffering.
So it's really interesting to hear that. You talk about it with respect to categories. I'm sort of curious if we dive deeper on that, have the big brands gotten bigger? Those are those that are well known, well established, and the smaller brands, it's been harder for new brands to come in, and the smaller brands have actually sort of whittled away, or have you gotten into that level of detail?
Well, because we're covering so many brands, it's hard to be absolutely specific, but the impression that I've got is, first of all, within the retail category, the ones that are more reliant on bricks and mortar have really done badly. And so many of them are shutting, particularly in high streets, but also the chains. So they are shutting. The ones that have been swift on their feet and are good at doing internet and have adapted to internet, and the ones that are internet, like Amazon, are absolutely booming. And so to a large extent, own label products have gone up to some extent. But what we've seen is that when people are buying online, they're making fairly quick decisions. They tend to go to the brands they know because, otherwise you'd be in a shop mulling it over, looking at them, thinking, oh, yeah, this is a good one, that's a bad one.
Yeah.
And it takes you a while. When you are just faced with an online choice, there is a tendency for most people to go for the good brand in inverted commas, which means the one they know. So we think there's been a concentration on the top brands. But on the other side, there's been a little bit more of a flight to quality own label. Generally speaking, because people can't spend their money on anything else, they are spending a lot more on shopping and therefore treating themselves. And the people who are really losing out are people like car companies and airlines and so on. The other big discretionary purchases are out the window. So people are treating themselves on the other stuff.
So David, great point. I think especially, when you think about customer behavior changing and so on, I think I would love to hear a little bit more internally within brand finance. Obviously, as you mentioned, you've seen this, given that it's the 25th year, you've seen many other crises come and go. And this one, has taken a longer period of time. It's been a year or so now. Within brand finance itself, you were distributed all across the world, but with London being one. How did those communications internally change? How did, were you communicating something differently to the stakeholders? How did you kind of take that journey within brand finance in terms of the last year?
Well, it's an interesting thing, actually, because we've always had this old-fashioned view that working from home was sort of like the euphemism for skiving, like, oh yeah, he's working from home. And so when people asked us, oh, do you mind if I come in late because I want to work from home? There was always a great deal of skepticism. And we did eventually say, well, senior people, directors can work from home, but we don't want you to do it more than one day a week or something of that kind. Well, I think the thing which has really changed everyone's perceptions is that overnight, we were all forced to be working from home in our home offices. The company provided everyone with computers and access, and we're all on Teams, we're all on Zoom, we shared IT platforms, etc., etc. So our IT people worked overtime to get everyone connected, and what we have found is that people are very productive working from home, probably more productive. There's no commuting. There's no things to distract you. And I think lawyers have said the same. I've spoken to quite a lot of lawyers, and they said their lawyers all locked at home are on average doing 2 or 3 hours extra work a day, which is billable hours. So the lawyers, I think, have boomed during this period. And to some extent, the same is true with us. We certainly have found that this form of communication is almost as good as face-to-face communication. And so from an internal point of view, it's worked very well. But one of the things that's happened is that because we were a bit nervous, and also because it's hard to do it, we have not been recruiting for the last year. So 1 or 2 people have we haven't made anybody redundant, but 1 or 2 people have left, and 1 or 2 people have decided to do something else. So there's been a bit of whittling away of the staff over the year, but we haven't recruited anyone new. So it's worked fine to this point. But going forward, if everyone was working from home, it becomes very difficult because, if you recruit a new person and say, right, you're starting on Monday, but you're working from home, it's very difficult to get them into the culture and showing how to do things. And we are just in the phase now of recruiting our next new wave of analysts. And, we're in quite an active recruitment mode. We've got to recruit 4 or 5 people. And we are faced with this dilemma of, well, how do we train them and make them feel at home?
Yeah, that will be a dilemma as you go forward. I'm sure you'll work it out, and hopefully we're not going to be doing this from home for that much longer. So, keeping the hopes up on that. Earlier you mentioned that you do brand evaluation and e-brand evaluation. And you also mentioned people buying more and more online in that process. I'm sort of curious about what is it that companies are doing to sort of affect their e-brand versus their normal brand, and have you played much of a role in sort of evaluating what they're doing on the electronic and digital side?
Well, I think it's a bit hard to generalize across the whole economy, but I think there were some companies that were further ahead in terms of digitalizing their offer and bringing everything online, and some that were further behind. So there are 1 or 2 retailers in the UK, like Next, for example, that are very, very digitally oriented. They're a fashion retailer. They're very digitally oriented. And I think they found it pretty easy to switch and not to have so much of the offline, the bricks and mortar type stuff. And to a large extent, they haven't really suffered. And then there are 1 or 2 brands like ASOS, as seen on screen, where it's 100% online retail. But then if you go across to another brand like, well, I'm using English brands now, but John Lewis, which is a very big, very well-known established department store, they've had a catastrophic year. They lost 500 million quid, they said yesterday. They're shutting about half their stores, and they were pretty slow, I think, to get their online effort together. So it really depended at what stage of development they were and how geared up they were to respond. And some have very well and some haven't.
So David, kind of continuing on that trend of the digital brands and so on, one of the things, and Dave and I were chatting before this interview started, we would love to get your perspective on is, brands clearly, more digital, perhaps they are communicating with their consumers, but so are some of these influencers. So are some of the individuals, so to speak, who are becoming brands in themselves. Would love to hear your thoughts on how the last year perhaps have some of these influencers become even more quote unquote brand worthy slash financially more valuable, so to speak, than perhaps even before?
Well, I suppose, as you'd probably imagine, I'm not the greatest digital native and social media expert, but my impression is that because people were locked away at home, there was a lot more opportunity for people to be watching. One of the features of the last year has been there's vastly more consumption of all forms of entertainment, TV, streaming, and online. And therefore, the extent to which people are looking at influencers and looking at blogs and so on has increased significantly. So, various people, there's a guy called Joe Wicks, who was a gym teacher. And I think before the crisis hit, he was just a gym teacher at a local school. But then when everyone was closed down, he started doing them online to keep his kids entertained. And he was so good that he got to the point where he had millions of followers and the mothers were all doing it. He became an absolute sensation. And so that's really an example of an online influencer getting people to exercise. And there have been similar examples with food, with makeup, with clothing, with mental health and so on. Even, for example, my son's girlfriend is actually a Suzuki violin teacher. And so she had to switch from doing Suzuki violin for 3 to 8 year olds, the tiny kids learning how to play violin. They were doing it all physically, but overnight they had to do it all online. And I think there have been many, many examples of that, which will go on beyond the crisis.
So great. You got to plug in for your son's girlfriend. I'm sure you'll get accolades for that when you get home. But let me follow up with this because you were doing a measurement of the value of product brands, and then you mentioned corporate brands, and I know you do country brands. But have you been measuring the brand of an individual and what its value might be?
By an individual, do you mean someone like Kim Kardashian or
like
Meghan
Kim
Markle?
Kardashian, yeah. Or the Queen or whatever, you could come up with various different brand values. I'm wondering, the violin instructor, whether or not she has a brand value.
Yeah, well, we haven't been explicitly researching individuals. I mean, over the years, about once every 2 or 3 years, we do an analysis of what we think the monarchy is worth. And because they're always referred to as the firm, we decided to do it as an enterprise valuation. So we looked at all the tangible assets and put a value on them, which I think at the last count was about £40 billion for all the palaces and jewels and all that stuff. And then we also looked at the benefits we think it brings to the UK economy and do a net present value on it. And that was about the same again. So we published a number saying, we believe this as an enterprise is worth 80 billion, which is extremely popular with the media. Within that, you have a whole load of individuals, one of which is the Queen. She's the most important one. And the Queen is definitely a very strong influencer, even though she's nearly 100 years old. And when she says a product's good, everyone believes it's a good product. But we have not actually explicitly measured individuals as brands. But you can just see it, like if you look at Kylie Jenner or Kim Kardashian, or Gwyneth Paltrow or various others, or Oprah Winfrey, for example, they have created very strong brands and very strong businesses behind.
Right. So let me follow up just on the other side of that. I also mentioned you have been doing country brands. And I want to connect that with our discussion about COVID and the pandemic. How do you think the brand of a country has been affected by how they've handled the whole COVID situation? And I'm thinking in particular about, some of the perception of China being the origin of it, the UK variant. You've got your own brand to a variant of COVID. Israel doing a great job of vaccination. So how have countries' brands been affected by how they've handled COVID, at least in your perception?
Yeah, well, we do an annual survey on what we call soft power, which is basically asking people's perceptions. It's very similar to the thing that you've been involved with, Dave. And this year, because of the exceptional year, we added on questions specifically about how well we thought they had dealt with the COVID crisis. I'm sorry to say that America actually came last out of 105 countries that we asked about, because I think Donald Trump was meant to have made a complete hash of it. And many countries you would think had done well came quite low down the table. But the point was that we actually did our research in October, November. And what I would say is that it's been a roller coaster, and that through the last year or so, countries are seen to have been doing a great job, and then suddenly they're not. Right. So if you take someone like Sweden, at the beginning, everyone thought they were the bee's knees and doing a good job, and they had low infection rates, but they weren't clamping down. And then all of a sudden, they started getting very high infection rates. And now people are saying that they were negligent and made mistakes and it was a bad idea. If you take someone somewhere like China, at the beginning, there were a lot of accusations, particularly from good old Donald Trump, that it was all their fault. They deny that, absolutely. They think it was coincidental that the first cases arose in China, and that they have dealt with the situation very well. Now, fact is, whoever is right about where it started, the Chinese have dealt with it extremely well, and they have created cures for it with their Sinovac, which they are now rolling out in industrial qualities to the rest of the world. And they are using it as an instrument of building up perceptions of China as someone who helps the world. And one of the interesting things is, if you look at the EU, they have dismally failed because they got it all completely wrong. And they got it wrong in clamping down. They got it wrong in controlling it. They got it wrong in testing and tracing. And they got it wrong generally with the vaccine programs. So the EU are looking like total nincompoops. And at the beginning, the UK, for example, was being vilified, and Boris was being vilified for having been incompetent, and all his ministers were incompetent. But in the last month or so, they have been resuscitated because they bet the right way on the vaccines. And fortunately, we've got some, good institutions in Britain that have pushed forward with it. But they were quick. They made the right bet, and now they're rolling it out. So all of a sudden, Britain looks okay. So I would say that the interesting thing is the incredible ups and downs for different countries. If Joe Biden does a good job, 3 or 4 months from now, America will probably be, back there with everyone saying, wow, well, they had a slow start, but they really got it right in the end.
No, great point. And I think clearly, the last year itself has been so much up and down, lots of transitions. So David, as we're coming to the end of the half-hour mark or so, would love to hear again, your piece of advice, for example, somebody who's been, owning their own business for the last 25 years, obviously a lot of experience through the years, looking at many different crises. Would be great to kind of hear your advice to others out there. How, the last year has been tough, but as they think about the few months or maybe years to come, how should they kind of navigate through these times?
Well, I suppose I won't say anything original, but here are a few cliches which I think are true. If you start up your own business, you have to have tremendous self-confidence that you can do it. But above all, you have to like what you're doing and enjoy it, because there are going to be lots of really down periods. If you don't think you're good at it better than anybody else and enjoy it, you will never have the stamina to keep going, because virtually no businesses are successful immediately. It's a long slog. And where it comes to actually running businesses, the two things that I would say any entrepreneur has to be very careful about. One is overreaching themselves financially, and particularly in terms of cash flow. So they have to borrow lots of money or bring in investors on adverse terms. And the other one is treat your staff the right way, because it's your staff that are the ones that are going to get you to be successful. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs fail because they don't treat their staff the right way. And staff is the most complicated thing and difficult thing in any business as you go forward. But I think there are far too many businesses as well that just borrow too much. We have always been exceptionally cautious. We have no borrowing. We have no long-term debt. We are cash rich. And, we've got 6 months worth of operating expenses in the bank. That gives you a great deal of comfort that you are going to survive. And if you've got confidence in yourself that you can do it better than other people, you will survive. And so that would be my advice. Marshal your cash, look after your staff, but make sure you really like what you do.
It sounded like somebody who was grounded in accounting, but has learned how to run an organization. David, this has been great. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us. Good luck going forward, and I look forward to continuing our conversation. So thank you.
Good. See you then.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.